Good. All right. Okay. Okay. Every time we go to the grocery store and we go to get food, vegetables, fruits, pretty much anything you guys want, that's I guess not prepackaged. Um, these are all organic, what you're trying to find, but why don't we ever get the GMO products, or why isn't it ever explained why they're bad? And that's why I'm here today to explain to you that the stigma given to GMOs is one of the most overly exaggerated reasons ever in food production in history. And for basis, GMOs is genetically modified organisms. Food is categorized under this, and so many other things as well. Technically, you could say a dog is a GMO, the dogs, cats, birds, all the pets we have, these are all GMOs because they are genetically modified organisms. And through genetic modification, that also includes selective breeding. Selective breeding is the process of getting an animal or a plant that had traits that seem beneficial to you, and you bred them to get out a certain outcome of a gene that became more prominent with more breeding. Our ancestors did this a lot, and these are the three points I'm going to hit throughout the speech. The history and the meaning of GMOs, both cultural and scientific, and the second one is going to be my concession, the things people see wrong with GMOs, and the third is going to be the future, what we can do with GMOs and what they can do for us. Okay, the history of it. We've been making GMOs for thousands of years. Our ancestors have been, if they planted a certain crop and found out that it yielded above average than other crops, they saved the seeds and then planted them for the next one, and so on. It was selective survival of the fittest by our choice, and if a wolf was extraordinarily loyal, then they kept it around, and those traits became more defined as time went on. They found the traits that were beneficial to them and used them to their advantage. And that has obviously helped. We can see what it's done today. We have tons of types of dogs, tons of types of vegetables, like lettuce. Like lettuce, I believe. There's many types of, cabbage. There are many types of cabbage. Cauliflower goes into it. There are Brussels sprouts. All these are under the tree of a cabbage, but through genetic modification of selective breeding, this has been able to diversify. And that is, I guess, the technical definition, but looking at it through that way, it seems a little bit nitpicky on what it actually means. But the social definition of GMOs is when it actually goes into the lab and scientists are able to take out or put in a specific gene that they would like to incorporate. Instead of waiting a long time in two animals or two plants, putting them together, and then hopefully their offspring has the gene that you desired, through genetic modification, they can take it out very specifically, put in what they wanted, and through almost no error have the outcome they desired right after. There's no need for a second shot or anything because they've already got it. And that's what terrified people, and that's the reason why they got lack of funding, lack of support from the general public. And this brings me to why they, I guess, stopped funding it. Because throughout the world, GMs are praised, except in food. None of us complain that we have domesticated dogs or that food is easier to access through food marts, but also in the medical field. GM insulin, which is the insulin pen that you put in the thigh of normally diabetic people, that is widely praised and was a huge break in the medical field when it was first released. But it's identically the same thing. They made it the exact same way as that they would make the food. They were able to, what they do is they shoot radiation, just a small amount, into where they want, and it breaks up the DNA. That's the only way we can actually break up the DNA. And then once it actually breaks up, the DNA repairs itself, eliminating that one section of DNA that we didn't want, which either showed a recessive gene or something that we didn't really want inside that plant. And that is what we find as really weird, because radioactivity, okay, that can cause cancer and stuff like that, but there showed no links to the actual cutting of that gene through the radiation in the actual consumption of the food that people partook of. GMO foods are no more dangerous than their natural counterparts, and through 30 years of research through several different organizations, unions, all research ties up to this. A study from the Genetic Literacy Project shows that corn, the original strain of corn, was 1,000 times smaller and was consisted of 1.9% sugar. This thing was tiny. It was that small by like that high, and it was almost inedible. And this was the original strain of it. And as we all know now, corn is huge in comparison. It's actually roughly 1,000 times bigger and is composed of 7.9% sugar. So we've made major improvements of that. Not once have they been genetically modified inside a lab, but then they got an original strain of that corn and did the exact same thing, and were able to, through some years, they were able to get the original strain to the corn that we see now. So instead of it taking 2,000 years, it took about 20 to achieve the same result with the same amount of nutrition that we would get from regular corn. Now, for my second point, the concession. The concession is, people say that with GM crops that we will no longer need fertilizers because they will be able to develop their own fertilizers, their own preservatives. And with preservatives, you can just wash them off, eat them, and then that'll be it. It'd be totally fine. But once it's actually inside the crop, there's no getting rid of it. It's being made by the crop. There's no getting rid of it. So then people are plagued with the question of, if you're eating it, aren't you eating the pesticides? Isn't that poison? And yes, it is poison, and that is the main basis of many arguments. But what they fail to realize is it's laughably small, the amount that is actually inside of you. Poison is all about perspective. What can kill one species is completely harmless to another, and the amount. What is harmless to us can harm a bug. For example, coffee is incredibly poisonous to every insect, but is good for us. Chocolate is it's a guilty pleasure for us, but can kill dogs. And that's just to put that in perspective. I'm running out of time. Okay, the third point was what we can do with it, the future of it. GM crops are one of the most promising ideas that we have for the new world. They can alter our diet to see what is more beneficial, especially since our world is overpopulating. We can control the amount of food that everyone intakes, especially since we're reaching the limit of what our globe can handle at our current production rate. Instead of expanding agriculture, we can intensify it and reach the same outcome without destroying more forests, without pushing out more people into already overcrowded cities. And there are so many other possibilities, like the American chestnut tree. They made a new strain of it where it can absorb twice as much carbon out of the air as it once was originally. This is not yet implemented due to the lack of public support of this, but it's in one of the ballots, and it's currently going through processing right now. But me covering the three topics of the history, the concession of what people see wrong with it, and what we can do with it more, I hope you guys can take back from it that GMOs aren't necessarily bad at all. They're the step forward to cleaning and improving our biosphere in our irresponsible actions. Thank you.
So Tim, what did you think?
I thought his point was clear, that GMOs aren't as bad as they are claimed. One of the things I noticed was his attention getter is a little general. It came across as pretty much, you guys all go to the store and you've seen these labels, therefore, and then you can continue. So I would think I would have picked a more, I mean, it connected with everybody because they go to the store, but I think I would have picked something a little more unique. And for the first, I heard very few sources. You did have sources. You did have the one research from the Genetic Literacy Project, and the bill number that you forgot, but that was in there. The one for the your second point, where you talked about how some people are like, oh, there's poison in there, and you're saying, oh, there's such a small amount. Would have been nice to have comparison of, okay, well, how much will kill a little bit will kill a bug, but how many bugs, how much poison does it take to kill one bug? How many bugs will it take to kill a person? Something for that. Overall, I think you had a good flow, and the only other thing I think would be practice it couple more times because you got close to the end. You go, oh no, I'm running out of time. Yeah. So that seems to happen a lot. Right. So overall, good job on getting your point across. Just maybe a few more sources.
Thank you.
All right, some of the technical things that Timothy just mentioned, I think I'd agree with. I think that the introduction is not as interesting as it needs to be. It kind of gets into the subject in a sideways direction instead of going more directly at what you're talking about. Your position is clearly identified. That part's good. And I do think that you have a preview of what the supporting structure is going to be, although so much of that supporting structure seems to be about kind of describing what the genetic process is, convincing us that because we've done it successfully with animals that we shouldn't be worried about any of these other things. My guess would be a lot of people might point to certain animals and say, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have been doing that with the animals because we got bad outcomes on that, and point to X, Y, or Z animal that is a problem. Africanized honeybees, pit bulls that might be perceived as being particularly vicious, a variety of things that are potentially problematic. Just because we've done it for thousands of years in a natural way doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically safe. Genetic power, as Dr. Malcolm says, is the greatest power known in the planet, and it's one of those things that we wield with great risk. There are potential consequences here. What I think you are trying to do is assuage the worries that people have, especially about food. But that's the one thing that you talk about the least in the presentation, that we have experience with foods that have been genetically modified, that those foods have been safe, that we don't have any problems that people are worried about. You don't need, the only worry that you mention is the idea that the naturally occurring pesticides that would exist in the foods would then be potentially problematic for human beings, and then you try to diminish that, but your argument there doesn't feel like it's complete. And like I said, you sometimes get off on these tangents, like you were talking about, well, we stopped funding GMO research. I'm going, who stopped funding GMO research? Why are you telling me that we're not doing any of this sort of thing? The notion that there are problems with, and you made a reference to some ballot initiative that's being proposed. I don't know where that's going. So I think you're kind of all over the place on the subject, and you need to be a lot more focused. You need to say, genetically modified foods are safe for us to consume, that it's hysteria that scares people away from it, And here's the proof that it's all good. And by the way, there are real benefits from having this sort of thing too, which you kind of hint at in a couple of places, but don't really develop that much either. You know, the ability to feed more people or to avoid, you know, costly losses because of the pests and that sort of thing. I think that there's an argument to be made there. There's a lot of information on that, and that feels like it's the least developed part of the speech, and it would have been the easiest one to develop. Instead, we're getting a lot of, like I said, background information on genetics, which might be great for an informative speech, less useful for the persuasive speech. So we got to get that controversy up a little bit more. All right, thank you.